There is a city buried beneath the dry earth of southern Pakistan that should not exist. Not because it is old, though it is extraordinarily old, dating back roughly 4,600 years, according to current archaeological estimates. Not because it was large, though at its peak it may have held somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 residents. It should not exist because of what it contained. Planned streets laid out in precise grids, a sewage system more advanced than those found in many cities that exist right now, today, in the 21st century. Standardized weights and measures used across hundreds of miles of territory. Public baths engineered with waterproofing techniques that still confuse researchers who study them. This was not a primitive settlement of huts and campfires, scratching at survival in a river valley. This was a metropolis designed with an intelligence and forethought that challenges nearly everything we assume about the ancient world and its limitations. The city is called Mohenjo-Daro. The name itself is haunting. In Sindhi, the language of the region, it translates loosely to Mound of the Dead, and for centuries that is exactly what it appeared to be, a mound, a low hill of dust and silence sitting in the floodplain of the Indus River, surrounded by farmland and scrub brush, holding its secrets beneath layers of silt and clay and the slow accumulation of time. No one walking past it, no farmer tending fields nearby, no traveller crossing the dry landscape would have guessed that beneath their feet lay one of the most sophisticated urban centres the ancient world had ever produced. No one would have imagined that this forgotten, unremarkable hillock concealed the remains of a city that once rivaled, and in some ways clearly surpassed, the great cities of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt in its engineering, its social planning, and its sheer ambition for the collective good. But what makes Mohenjo-Daro truly unsettling is not what archaeologists found buried in its earth. It is what they could not explain. Researchers uncovered streets and walls and drains and granaries. They recovered thousands of small carved seals, bearing images of animals and symbols, arranged in careful rows. Those symbols appear to be a written language, a script used consistently across a vast territory. And yet, despite more than a century of effort by linguists, cryptographers, historians, mathematicians, and computer scientists, no one has managed to read a single word of it. The Indus script, as it is now known to scholars around the world, remains one of the last great undeciphered writing systems on the planet. An entire civilization, one that stretched across an area larger than the territories of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, left behind its words carved in stone and pressed into clay, and we cannot understand a single syllable. We are staring at messages created by people who built genuine marvels of engineering, and we have absolutely no idea what those people were trying to tell us. Their words are right there. We can see them. We can photograph them. We can hold the seals that carry them. And we are as illiterate before them as a child, standing before a page of text in a language that has never been taught. Think about what that means. We live in a world where artificial intelligence can translate between dozens of languages in real time, where supercomputers can model the folding of proteins and the movement of galaxies, and yet a writing system created by people who mastered hydraulic engineering before most of the world had figured out basic plumbing remains completely, stubbornly, maddeningly beyond our comprehension. And it gets stranger, because Mohenjo-Daro did not fall to invaders, at least not in any way that can be conclusively demonstrated. It did not burn in a single catastrophic fire, like Troy or Carthage. It did not collapse under the weight of political corruption or military overreach, as far as the surviving evidence can show. It simply emptied. Slowly, generation by generation, the people left, or they died, or something happened that we have not yet been able to identify with any certainty. The city was abandoned, buried under silt deposited by the Indus River, and forgotten for thousands of years. An entire way of life, an entire urban tradition, an entire body of accumulated knowledge and practice, gone. Erased not by conquerors wielding swords, but by the quiet, relentless passage of time and the simple act of forgetting. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Mohenjo-Daro is not simply another chapter in a dusty archaeology textbook. You are going to understand why its very existence challenges our models of how civilizations develop, how they organize themselves, and how they come apart. You are going to confront the deeply uncomfortable possibility that the ancient world was far more advanced, far more interconnected, and far more fragile than we have ever been taught in any classroom. And you are going to sit with a question that has no comfortable answer, a question that echoes across thousands of years. If a civilization this advanced, this organized, this ambitious can disappear so completely that even its language is lost to every generation that follows, what does that say about us? What does that say about everything we are building right now? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Mohenjo-Daro, we first have to understand the civilization that built it. And to understand that civilization, we need to step back and look at the broader picture of human settlement and achievement across the ancient world, because the story of Mohenjo-Daro is not simply the story of one city sitting in a floodplain. It is the story of an entire world that existed in the shadows of history, a world that we are only now, after a century of painstaking archaeological work, beginning to appreciate in its full scope and significance. The Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, named after the first of its major sites to be identified by modern researchers, is one of the great foundational cultures of the ancient world. It is considered one of the three cradles of urban civilization, alongside Mesopotamia in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and ancient Egypt along the Nile. According to current archaeological models, the Indus Valley civilization flourished in its mature, urban phase between roughly 3,300 and 1,900 years before the Common Era, a span of roughly 14 centuries, though some researchers push those dates both earlier and later, depending on how they interpret the transitional periods. Before the mature phase, there were centuries of gradual development, known as the early Harappan period, during which small farming communities in the Indus and Gagahakra river basins began to develop the technologies and social practices that would eventually characterize the full civilization. At its height, the mature Indus Valley civilization covered an estimated area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. To put that number in perspective, to make it tangible, that is larger than the territories associated with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It is roughly the size of modern-day Peru, or about twice the size of the state of Texas. This was not a small, localized culture clustered around a single river bend. This was a vast, sprawling network of settlements spanning diverse ecological zones, from the foothills of the mountains in the north to the coastal marshlands of the Arabian Sea in the south, from the arid plains of what is now eastern Iran to the fertile river valleys of what is now northwestern India. Hundreds of settlements have been identified within this territory, ranging in size from tiny farming hamlets to major urban centers. The estimates vary, but the total number of known Indus Valley sites now exceeds 1,500, and new ones continue to be discovered as archaeological surveys expand. Most of these sites are small, comprising perhaps a few dozen structures and a modest population, but several dozen are large enough to be classified as towns, and at least 5 or 6 qualify as genuine cities by the standards of the ancient world. The two largest and most thoroughly studied of these urban centers are Harappa, located in the Punjab region of modern Pakistan, and Mohenjo-Daro, located roughly 640 kilometers to the south in the Sindh province. Harappa was first noted by Charles Masson, a British deserter-turned-traveller and antiquarian in the 1820s. Masson described a vast ruined site with fired bricks, though at the time the significance of his observations was not recognized. Over the following decades, the bricks of Harappa were plundered for use as ballast in the construction of the Lahore-Multan railway line. Untold quantities of ancient building material were carted away and laid beneath railroad tracks, an act of destruction that is almost painful to contemplate now. It was not until the early 1920s, under the direction of Sir John Marshall, then Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, that systematic excavations began at Harappa and the true nature of the site became apparent. Mohenjo-Daro was identified slightly later. In 1922, Rahaldas Banerjee, known as R.D. Banerjee, an officer of the Archaeological Survey of India, visited the mound and recognized that it was not a Buddhist stupa, as earlier visitors had assumed, but something much older and much more significant. Under Marshall's overall supervision, excavations at Mohenjo-Daro began in earnest, and within a few years, the outlines of a major ancient city began to emerge from the earth. In 1924, Marshall published a notice in the Illustrated London News announcing the discovery to the broader world. The response was immediate and intense. Here was a civilization contemporary, with ancient Egypt and Sumer sitting in the Indus Valley, and no one in the modern world had known it existed. It was as if an entire room in the house of human history had been locked and forgotten, and someone had suddenly found the key. The excavations that followed over the next several decades, led by researchers including Ernest Mackay in the late 1920s and 30s, Mortimer Wheeler during the 1940s, and later by Pakistani and Indian archaeologists such as M. S. Vats, S. R. Rao, B. B. Lal and others, revealed a city of stunning sophistication. Mohenjo-Daro was not a haphazard collection of buildings that had grown organically over time, the way most ancient cities did, with new structures squeezed into whatever space was available. It was planned. Its streets ran in a grid pattern, oriented roughly along the cardinal directions, north-south and east-west. The main thoroughfares were wide, some estimated at roughly 10 meters across, broad enough for two carts to pass each other with room to spare. Smaller residential lanes branched off at right angles, creating a regular, orderly pattern of blocks and neighborhoods. The buildings were constructed primarily of fired brick and mud brick, with walls that in some cases still stand to a height of several meters. The fired bricks were of strikingly uniform dimensions, typically following a ratio of 4:2:1 in terms of length, width, and height. This is not a trivial detail. The uniformity of brick sizes across the city, and indeed across the entire Indus Valley civilization, implies a standardized system of production. Someone or some institution was setting specifications for bricks and ensuring that those specifications were followed across enormous distances and over extended periods of time. This is the kind of thing that requires either a powerful central authority or a deeply ingrained cultural consensus, and in either case, it represents a level of organizational sophistication that is difficult to explain for a civilization that has left us no evidence of kings, no monumental royal tombs, and no inscriptions celebrating the achievements of individual rulers. But it was the infrastructure beneath the streets that truly set Mohenjo-Daro apart from almost everything else in the ancient world, and indeed from much of the modern world as well. Nearly every house in the excavated portions of the city had its own private bathing area and a connection to a covered drainage system that ran beneath the streets. Private wells provided water for individual households. Wastewater from bathing areas and latrines flowed through clay pipes into brick-lined channels which ran along the edges of the streets or beneath them. These channels were covered with removable stone slabs or bricks, allowing them to be cleaned and maintained by whoever was responsible for the upkeep of the city's infrastructure. At intervals, the smaller drains fed into larger main drains that carried the waste away from the residential areas. The sophistication of this system is genuinely difficult to overstate. Many cities in the modern world did not achieve comparable levels of household sanitation and wastewater management until the 19th or even the 20th century. The idea that every house should have its own connection to a centralized drainage system, that wastewater should be carried away from living areas through covered channels, that those channels should be designed for easy maintenance. These ideas seem obvious to us now, but they were anything but obvious for most of human history. The Romans are often credited with pioneering urban water management, and their aqueducts and sewers were indeed impressive. But Rome was roughly 2,000 years younger than Mohenjo-Daro, and even Roman sanitation did not extend to every household in the way that Mohenjo-Daro's system appears to have done. To put this in the kind of scaled comparison that makes the timeline tangible, consider a specific historical parallel. The City of London, the capital of the British Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the world in the 19th century, did not have a comprehensive underground sewer system until the 1860s, when the Great Stink of 1858, a period during which the smell of untreated sewage in the River Thames became so unbearable that Parliament could not function, finally forced the government to act. Sir Joseph Bazalgette designed and oversaw the construction of London's sewer system over the next several years. Mohenjo-Daro had covered drains and household sanitation roughly 4,000 years earlier. That is not a small gap. That is a chasm in time so vast and so humbling that it should make us rethink what we mean when we casually use the word progress. Or consider another comparison, one that touches on commerce and administration rather than sanitation. The standardized weights and measures found across the Indus Valley civilization represent a level of commercial and administrative coordination that Europe would not achieve again until relatively modern times. The Harappan weight system was based on a binary progression, with the smallest weights doubling in mass at each step. 1 unit, 2 units, 4 units, 8 units, 16 units, 32 units, 64 units, and so on. This system was used consistently across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, from Harappa in the north to Lothal in the south. The precision of the weights themselves, small cubes of chert stone, carefully ground to exact masses, speaks to a culture that valued accuracy and uniformity in its commercial dealings. This kind of metrological standardization across such a vast area is, by any standard of the ancient world, astonishing. France did not formally adopt the metric system until 1799, after decades of effort by reformers who recognized that the chaotic patchwork of local measurement systems was hampering trade and administration. The Harappans achieved something functionally similar more than 4,000 years before the French Revolution. The math is striking. The gap between what this civilization accomplished and when the rest of the world caught up is not measured in mere centuries. It is measured in millennia, in spans of time so long that entire empires rose and fell within the interval. Beyond the infrastructure, the material culture of the Indus Valley civilization reveals a society of considerable artistic and technical sophistication. The bead-making industry, centered at sites like Chandhu-Daro, a small manufacturing town southeast of Mohenjo-Daro, produced carnelian beads of extraordinary quality, using a technique known as heating and etching. Long barrel-shaped carnelian beads, some reaching lengths of 13 centimeters or more, required a multi-step process of drilling, shaping, polishing, and heat treatment that demanded both skill and patience. These beads were traded across the ancient world and have been found in Mesopotamian royal tombs, indicating that they were valued as luxury goods far beyond the borders of the Indus Valley itself. The pottery of the Indus Valley, while less frequently discussed than its architecture, is equally revealing. Potters across the civilization produced a distinctive red-slipped ware decorated with black geometric patterns, animal motifs, and occasionally human figures. The consistency of these decorative styles across hundreds of sites, spanning the full geographic range of the civilization, further reinforces the picture of a culture bound together by shared aesthetic standards and production norms. Whether these norms were enforced by a central authority or maintained by a network of craft guilds and apprenticeship traditions, we cannot say. The script that might have told us about the organization of craft production remains unread. The bronze and copper metallurgy of the Indus Valley civilization was advanced by the standards of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Workers produced a range of tools, weapons, and ornamental objects using techniques that included casting in open and closed molds, cold hammering, and annealing, the process of heating metal to make it softer and more workable. A famous bronze figurine recovered from Mohenjo-Daro, often called the Dancing Girl, depicts a young woman standing in a relaxed, confident pose with one hand on her hip, wearing bangles on her arms and apparently nothing else. The figurine is small, roughly 10.8 centimeters tall, but it is deeply expressive, capturing a sense of personality and individuality that transcends the millennia between its creation and our encounter with it. Whoever made this figurine was not merely a competent metalworker. They were an artist, capable of capturing human character in bronze with a skill that commands respect. The terracotta figurines found across Indus Valley sites also offer tantalizing glimpses into the daily life and perhaps the religious practices of the civilization. Hundreds of small clay figurines have been recovered, depicting animals, humans, and hybrid creatures. Many of the female figurines are elaborately adorned with jewelry and headdresses, leading some scholars to propose that they represent mother goddesses or fertility figures, though this interpretation remains speculative. Male figurines are less common but include representations of what appear to be seated figures in meditative or contemplative postures. Small clay carts with wheels, miniature versions of the bullock carts that presumably served as the primary overland transport, have also been found, and these are particularly poignant because they suggest that children in Mohenjo-Daro played with toy versions of the vehicles they saw in the streets, just as children everywhere have always done. The trade networks of the Indus Valley extended far beyond the boundaries of the civilization itself. To the west, Indus merchants traded with Mesopotamia, either directly or through intermediary ports in the Persian Gulf region. Indus seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites including Kish, and Tel Asmar. A settlement at Shortagai, in northern Afghanistan, near the lapis lazuli mines of Badakhshan, appears to have been an Indus Valley trading outpost established to secure access to the prized blue stone. To the south, the site of Lothal, located near the Gulf of Cambay in modern Gujarat, contained what some archaeologists interpret as a dockyard, a large rectangular basin that may have been used for loading and unloading merchant ships. This interpretation is debated, but if correct, it would represent one of the earliest known purpose-built harbour facilities in the world. The trade goods that moved through these networks included not only carnelian beads and lapis lazuli, but also cotton textiles, as the Indus Valley is believed to have been among the earliest regions in the world to cultivate cotton and weave it into cloth. Impressions of cotton cloth have been found on Indus Valley artifacts, and Mesopotamian texts may refer to Meluhan textiles as trade goods. The geographic scope of these connections is remarkable, from Shortugai in the mountains of Afghanistan to Lothal on the coast of the Arabian Sea. From the great cities of the Punjab to trading partners in the Persian Gulf, the Indus Valley civilization maintained a web of economic relationships that spanned thousands of kilometers. The logistics of managing this trade, of coordinating the production, transport, storage, and exchange of goods across such distances, represent an organizational achievement of the first order, and we understand almost none of it from the perspective of the Harappans themselves, because their records, if they kept any beyond the brief inscriptions on their seals, are either unrecovered or unreadable. There is another layer of scale that deserves careful attention, and it concerns what has been lost, what remains unknown, what lies beyond the reach of current research. Of the roughly 1,500 Indus Valley sites that have been identified, only a small fraction have been excavated, and none of the major sites has been completely uncovered. Mohenjo-Daro itself has only been partially exposed. The site is divided into two main areas: the Citadel Mound, an elevated platform in the western part of the city that contained the Great Bath, possible granaries, and what appears to have been a large assembly hall, and the Lower City, a much larger area to the east that contained the residential and commercial districts. Only a portion of either area has been excavated, and the oldest levels of the city, the layers that might tell us how Mohenjo-Daro was founded and how its remarkable urban plan was first conceived, lie below the current water table. The underground water level in the area has risen over the millennia, saturating the lowest archaeological layers and making them inaccessible with standard excavation techniques. What we know about Mohenjo-Daro is based almost entirely on what we have been able to recover from the upper layers. The deeper layers, the ones that hold the origins of the city, remain locked away in waterlogged earth, protected and imprisoned in equal measure. And even the portions that have been exposed are now in serious danger. Salt crystallization, caused by the high water table and the arid climate, is steadily destroying the ancient bricks. Moisture wicks up through the foundations, carrying dissolved salts and when the water evaporates in the dry heat, the salts crystallize within the brick, causing the material to crack and crumble. This process, known as salt weathering, is relentless and extraordinarily difficult to counter. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, commonly known as UNESCO, declared Mohenjo-Daro a World Heritage Site in 1980, and various preservation campaigns have been launched in the decades since. International teams have tried coating the bricks with protective agents, improving drainage around the site, and limiting visitor access to reduce physical wear. But the fundamental problem, the high water table and the salt it carries, remains unsolved. Some archaeologists and conservators have warned that without a dramatic, large-scale intervention, the exposed ruins of Mohenjo-Daro could be lost within a generation or two. The city that survived 4,000 years underground may not survive another century above it. The scale of the Indus Valley civilization also challenges us to think about population and social organization in new ways. At its peak, according to various scholarly estimates, the entire civilization may have supported a population of roughly 5 million people. 5 million. That would have made it one of the most populous societies on Earth at the time, rivaling or exceeding the populations of contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. And unlike Egypt, which organized itself around the centralized authority of the pharaoh, and the divine right of kings, or Mesopotamia, which fragmented into competing city-states ruled by warrior monarchs and priestly elites, the Indus Valley civilization shows almost no clear evidence of centralized political authority of the kind we are accustomed to seeing. There are no grand palaces in the ruins, no monumental statues of rulers gazing imperiously at their subjects, no inscriptions celebrating military victories or listing the conquests of kings, no depictions of rulers subjugating enemies underfoot, a common motif in Egyptian and Mesopotamian art. No evidence of elaborate royal burials filled with gold and precious goods. The burials that have been found at Indus Valley sites are relatively modest by the standards of the ancient world. Grave goods are present, but not lavish. There is no evidence of the kind of extreme social stratification, the gulf between the tombs of kings and the tombs of commoners, that characterizes many other ancient civilizations. This absence is profoundly puzzling. Every other major civilization of comparable scale that we know of had some form of visible, centralized political authority. How did 5 million people, spread across more than 1 million square kilometers, coordinate the production of standardized bricks, maintain uniform systems of weights and measures, build and maintain urban infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication, and conduct long-distance trade across land and sea, all without, apparently, a king to command them? What held this civilization together? What authority ensured that the brick in Mohenjo-Daro were the same size as the bricks in Harappa, 640 kilometers away? What institution, what tradition, what shared understanding made this level of coordination possible without the coercive power of a royal court and a standing army? We do not know, and because we cannot read the Indus script, we may never know. This is the foundation upon which the entire mystery rests, a civilization of extraordinary reach and sophistication. Cities planned with a precision that implies either a powerful central authority or a profound and deeply ingrained cultural consensus. Infrastructure that outpaced much of the modern world by thousands of years. A writing system that remains locked behind a wall of silence. And a collapse so complete that the civilization was forgotten for millennia, buried not just under silt, but under the weight of our own ignorance. The central question, then, is not simply, what was Mohenjo-Daro? The central question is far more unsettling, far more difficult, far more personal than that. How did a civilization this advanced, this organized, this widespread, simply disappear? How did all of that knowledge, all of that skill, all of that accumulated wisdom simply evaporate? And what might we be missing about the capabilities of the ancient world, and about the vulnerabilities of our own, that would allow such a complete and thorough disappearance to make sense? The answer to that question takes us deeper than archaeology usually ventures, and it begins with what the city itself can tell us, what it whispers through its bricks and drains and silent, unreadable seals, if we are patient enough and humble enough to listen. When you walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro today, assuming the Pakistani authorities grant access and the site has not deteriorated beyond the point of meaningful visitation, you find yourself standing in the remains of something that does not fit the standard narrative of human development. The standard narrative, the one taught in most schools and assumed in most popular histories, says that civilization develops in a roughly linear fashion. Small settlements become villages, villages become towns, towns become cities, and with each step along this progression, technology and social organization grow more complex. It is a tidy, reassuring story. It suggests that where we are now is better than where we were, and that where we are going will be better still. It implies a steady upward march, a reliable escalator of progress in humanity from simplicity to sophistication. In the case of Mohenjo-Daro, this story is possibly and disturbingly wrong. The problem is that Mohenjo-Daro does not appear, based on the evidence currently available, to have grown gradually into the sophisticated city that the upper archaeological layers reveal. The earliest accessible layers of the site already show evidence of planned streets and sophisticated drainage infrastructure. There is no clear, unambiguous archaeological record of a primitive village slowly evolving into a planned metropolis through a series of incremental improvements. The city seems to appear, as far as we can tell from what has been excavated, already organized, already advanced, already operating according to principles of urban planning that would not become common elsewhere for thousands of years. Now, the most cautious interpretation of this evidence is that the missing evolutionary stages, the primitive beginnings, the slow accretion of complexity, are simply buried in those inaccessible lower layers, drowned beneath the water table that has risen over the millennia. This is entirely possible, and many serious, careful archaeologists hold this view. They argue that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that if we could only reach those lower layers, we would find exactly the kind of gradual development that the standard model predicts. This is a reasonable position, but it is also, at this point, an assumption. It is a statement of faith in the standard model, not a conclusion drawn from evidence. The evidence we actually have, the evidence we can actually see and touch and measure, shows a city that was already sophisticated from the moment we can observe it. The Great Bath is perhaps the most famous single structure at Mohenjo-Daro, and it illustrates the core problem with perfect clarity. Located in the elevated western portion of the city, an area that archaeologists refer to as the Citadel Mound, the Great Bath is a rectangular pool measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. It was constructed of finely fitted bricks and lined with a thick layer of natural bitumen, a tar-like substance that occurs naturally in certain geological formations, to create a watertight seal. The floor of the bath was carefully graded to slope toward a drain at one corner, allowing the entire pool to be emptied when needed. An inlet system allowed it to be refilled. Steps led down into the water from both the north and south ends, with small ledges along the edges that may have served as seats or as platforms for specific ritual activities. The engineering of the Great Bath is remarkable by any standard, ancient, or modern. The waterproofing technique alone represents a sophisticated understanding of materials science. Bitumen had to be identified in its natural deposits, harvested, transported to the site, heated to the correct temperature, and applied in layers to create a durable, continuous seal across the entire interior surface of the pool. The bricks had to be fitted with precision to create a smooth, regular surface. The drainage system had to be designed to handle the full volume of the pool, channeling the water away from the structure without undermining its foundations, and the entire complex was surrounded by additional rooms and corridors, some of which may have been used for changing, for ritual preparation, or for housing attendants responsible for the upkeep of the facility. The purpose of the Great Bath is unknown. Speculation has ranged widely. Some scholars have proposed that it was used for ritual purification, drawing parallels to the importance of ritual bathing in later Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Others have suggested it was a public bathing facility, a kind of ancient communal swimming pool. Still others have proposed that it served an administrative function, perhaps as a site where important decisions were made or where visiting dignitaries were received. We do not know, and because we cannot read the Indus script, we may never know with any certainty what happened in that pool, what words were spoken there, what significance it held for the people who built and maintained it over the centuries. But the Great Bath is only one structure among many. Across the excavated portions of Mohenjo-Daro, researchers have found evidence of large buildings that may have served as granaries or communal storage facilities. They have found what appear to be assembly halls, large open spaces with rows of pillars that may have supported wooden roofs. They have found residential blocks of varying sizes, some larger and more elaborate than others, suggesting differences in wealth or status, though not the extreme disparities found in many other ancient cities. They have found workshops where beads, pottery, and metal tools were produced. They have found evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, including objects made of copper, bronze, lead, and tin. The residential architecture is particularly revealing. Houses in Mohenjo-Daro were typically built around central courtyards, with rooms arranged to maximize privacy and natural ventilation. Many had internal staircases, indicating that the structures were multi-story, most likely 2 or sometimes 3 floors high. Windows and doorways generally faced the interior courtyard or the narrow back lanes rather than the main streets, a design choice that suggests a pronounced concern for privacy and perhaps also for protection from noise and dust. The uniformity of the construction techniques, the consistent use of standard-sized bricks, the regular layout of streets and drains, all of this implies a coordinated, intentional approach to urban development that stands in sharp contrast to the organic, unplanned growth characteristic of most ancient settlements, and indeed of many modern cities. But here is the problem. We have all of this physical evidence, these remarkable walls and drains and baths and granaries and workshops, and yet we understand almost nothing about the people who built them in any meaningful human sense. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know the name of a single person who ever lived in Mohenjo-Daro. We do not know their religion in any detail, though certain recurring images on the seals, such as a figure seated in what appears to be a meditative posture surrounded by animals, or a scene that may depict a figure battling or embracing tigers, have generated extensive and often contradictory speculation. We do not know their political system. We do not know their laws. We do not know their mythology, their creation stories, their understanding of death and what comes after. We do not know what they taught their children. We do not know what they feared. All of that information, everything that would make these people real to us as human beings rather than as abstract builders, is locked inside a script that we cannot read. The Indus script is the great barrier that separates us from the minds of the people who created Mohenjo-Daro. Approximately 4,200 inscribed objects have been recovered from Indus Valley sites, the vast majority of them being small square or rectangular seals made of steatite, a soft, easily carved stone. These seals are typically between 2 and 4 centimeters on a side. Most bear an image on one face, commonly of a bull-like animal, frequently described as a unicorn, because it appears in profile with a single horn, though many scholars believe this is simply an artistic convention showing a 2-horned animal from the side. Other animals depicted include elephants, water buffalo, rhinoceroses, tigers, and a creature sometimes called a short-horned bull that may represent a different species. Above or around the animal image are sequences of signs. The Indus script proper, usually between 4 and 6 characters long, though some inscriptions contain more and a very few contain fewer. The total number of distinct signs identified in the Indus script ranges from about 390 to 460, depending on the researcher and the criteria used to distinguish independent signs from mere variants or ligatures. This count is significant for one crucial reason. If the script contained fewer than about 30 distinct signs, it would almost certainly be an alphabet, a system in which each sign represents a single sound. If it contained more than several hundred, it would likely be a purely logographic system, like early Chinese script, in which each sign represents an entire word or concept. The Indus script falls into a range that suggests it is most likely a logosyllabic system, combining elements of both approaches, meaning that some signs represent words and others represent syllables. This would make it similar in principle, though not necessarily in detail, to the scripts of ancient Sumer or Egypt, but this is inference drawn from the number of signs, not from any actual reading of the script. It is a hypothesis, not a decipherment, and it gets worse. The inscriptions found on the seals are almost all very short. The average length is fewer than 5 signs. The longest known inscription, found on a sign or plaque rather than a seal, contains only about 26 signs. This extreme brevity makes statistical analysis extraordinarily difficult. Successful decipherments of ancient scripts, such as the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s, or the decipherment of Linear B by Michael Ventris in 1952, relied on the availability of relatively long texts that provided enough data to identify recurring patterns, grammatical structures, word boundaries, and the relationships between signs. The Indus inscriptions are simply too short for these methods to work with any reliability. Trying to reconstruct an entire language from inscriptions averaging fewer than 5 signs is like trying to reconstruct the English language from a collection of license plates and bumper stickers. The data is too thin, the sample is too fragmentary. The task, given the currently available evidence, may well be impossible. This has not stopped people from trying, and the history of attempted decipherments is itself a fascinating, frustrating saga. Dozens of scholars have proposed readings of the Indus script over the past century. Some of these proposals have been careful, methodical, and modest in their claims. Others have been ambitious to the point of recklessness. A few have been outright fraudulent. Among the most serious and sustained efforts has been the work of Asko Parpola, a Finnish Indologist who has spent more than 50 years studying the Indus script. Parpola has proposed that the script encodes a Dravidian language, one belonging to the family of languages spoken today primarily in southern India, including Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. His arguments are detailed, drawing on comparisons between the Indus signs and early Dravidian vocabulary, as well as on cultural parallels between the Indus Valley civilization and later Dravidian traditions. Parpola published a comprehensive summary of his work in 2015, and it remains one of the most rigorous attempts at decipherment. But it has not achieved consensus. Other scholars have raised serious objections to specific readings and to the underlying assumption of a Dravidian linguistic connection. An alternative line of research has proposed connections between the Indus script and the Indo-European language family, the vast group of languages that includes Hindi, Persian, Greek, Latin, and English. This line of argument is politically charged because it intersects with long-running debates about the origins of Indo-European languages and peoples in South Asia, debates that carry significant cultural and nationalist weight in modern India and Pakistan. Some scholars have argued that the Indus Valley civilization was itself Indo-European speaking, while others maintain that the Indo-European languages arrived in South Asia later, brought by migrating or invading populations from Central Asia. In 2004, a team of researchers led by Steve Farmer, a historian of science, Richard Sproat, a computational linguist, and Michael Witzel, a Sanskrit scholar, published a provocative paper arguing that the Indus signs might not represent language at all. They proposed that the signs were non-linguistic symbols, comparable to coats of arms, religious symbols, or clan markers, rather than a script encoding spoken language. This paper generated enormous controversy. Rajesh Rao, a computational neuroscientist, responded with statistical analyses in 2009 and subsequent years, using mathematical models to demonstrate that the Indus signs exhibited patterns of sequential order and conditional probability consistent with a linguistic system, not with a random or non-linguistic symbolic system. The debate continues to this day, with strong arguments on both sides and no resolution in sight. The debate continues to this day, with strong arguments on both sides and no resolution in sight. Meanwhile, new approaches continue to be explored. Researchers have applied techniques from network analysis, information theory, and machine learning to the corpus of Indus inscriptions, hoping that computational methods might succeed where human intuition has failed. Brian Wells, an independent researcher, has spent decades compiling the most comprehensive corpus of Indus signs and their contexts. Iravatham Mahadevan, an Indian epigrapher who passed away in 2018, devoted the latter part of his career to the Indus script, proposing readings based on Dravidian linguistic models and publishing a detailed concordance of Indus inscriptions that remains an indispensable reference for other researchers. One of the most intriguing recent developments has been the discovery of a large signboard at the site of Dholavira, in the Rann of Kutch in Gujarat. This signboard, found fallen near one of the city's gateways, bears 10 large Indus signs, each roughly 37 centimeters tall, which appear to have been originally inlaid into a wooden board and mounted above the entrance to the city. This is by far the largest Indus inscription ever found, and its placement above a gateway suggests that it served a public function, perhaps identifying the city, or its ruler, or the deity to whom the city was dedicated, or something else entirely that we cannot even guess at without the ability to read the script. The Dholavira signboard has been called the Indus Valley's Rosetta Stone, but the comparison is misleading, because the Rosetta Stone provided translations in 3 scripts, one of which was already known. The Dholavira signboard gives us 10 signs in one undeciphered script, with no translation in any known language. It is not a key, it is another lock. The seals themselves, beyond their inscriptions, are objects of considerable beauty and craftsmanship. The most common seal type, the unicorn seal, typically shows a single-horned animal standing before an object that has been variously interpreted as a manger, a brazier, a ritual stand, or a combination of these. The animal is rendered with a naturalism and a confidence of line that speaks to a long artistic tradition. Other seal designs are more enigmatic. One famous seal from Mohenjo-Daro, often called the Pashupati seal or the Proto-Shiva seal, shows a figure seated on a low platform with legs drawn up in what appears to be a cross-legged position, wearing a headdress with horns or branches, surrounded by animals including an elephant, a tiger, a rhinoceros, and a water buffalo. This image has been the subject of intense debate since its discovery. Some scholars see in it a prototype of the Hindu god Shiva in his aspect as Pashupati, the lord of animals. Others argue that this interpretation projects later religious concepts backward onto an image, whose original meaning may have been entirely different. Without the ability to read the accompanying inscription or any other Indus text that might provide context, the debate cannot be resolved. There are also seal images that depict scenes of apparent narrative content, figures grappling with animals, figures standing in trees, figures making offerings or performing gestures whose significance is lost to us. Each of these images is a window into a world we cannot fully see, a fragmentary glimpse of rituals, myths, or social practices that were presumably as vivid and meaningful to the people of Mohenjo-Daro as our own cultural images and symbols are to us. A person from that era, looking at one of these seals, would presumably have understood immediately what the scene depicted and what it meant. We can only guess, and our guesses are inevitably shaped by our own cultural assumptions and prejudices. The copper tablets found at Mohenjo-Daro add another layer of mystery. These small rectangular copper objects bear inscriptions and images similar to those on the steatite seals, but are sometimes longer and more detailed. Some copper tablets appear to show scenes of sacrifice or ritual activity. Others bear images of mythological creatures, including a half-human, half-animal figure that appears on several tablets. The function of these tablets is unknown. They may have served as identity markers, as tokens of authority, as votive offerings, or as some kind of commercial document. Without the ability to read the inscriptions they carry, their purpose remains a matter of speculation. In the meantime, the silence of the Indus script means that entire dimensions of this civilization remain permanently invisible to us, or at least invisible until and unless the script is someday deciphered. We can see what the people of Mohenjo-Daro built. We can measure what they made. We can weigh their weights and count their beads and analyze the chemical composition of their pottery. But we cannot hear what they said. We cannot understand their thoughts, their arguments, their explanations of why they organized their city the way they did, or what they believed about the world they lived in. The voices are gone. The meaning is gone. We are left with objects and architecture and a profound aching emptiness where human understanding should be. This brings us to the most disturbing question surrounding Mohenjo-daro. What happened? Why was the city abandoned? Why did the entire Indus Valley civilization decline and eventually vanish? The city shows evidence of multiple phases of habitation. Buildings were constructed, damaged or demolished, and rebuilt over and over across the centuries. In the upper layers, the most recent layers, the signs of decline become unmistakable. Structures were less carefully built, using reused bricks and sloppier masonry. The drainage system, that marvel of engineering, fell into disrepair. Channels silted up, connections broke. The precise grid layout of the streets began to degrade as newer buildings were erected over older foundations, without regard for the original plan. Houses were subdivided into smaller and smaller units, suggesting either population pressure or economic decline, or possibly both. Craft production declined in quality. Trade goods from distant regions became less common. Something was going wrong. Slowly, incrementally, across generations, the city was dying. The earliest and most dramatic theory of Mohenjo-daro's demise was proposed by Mortimer Wheeler, the forceful British archaeologist who excavated at both Mohenjo-daro and Harappa during the 1940s. Wheeler pointed to a collection of human skeletal remains found scattered in the upper levels of the site. Roughly 37 skeletons were found in various locations, some lying in the streets, some in houses, some showing evidence of violent trauma such as skull fractures. Wheeler proposed a dramatic narrative, the Aryan invasion. According to his theory, Indo-Aryan warriors, migrating into the Indian subcontinent from the northwest, had stormed Mohenjo-daro and massacred its inhabitants. He drew connections to the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Hindu sacred texts, in which the warrior god Indra is described as a fort destroyer who shattered the strongholds of his enemies. Wheeler saw in Mohenjo-daro the ruins of one of Indra's conquered fortresses, and in the scattered skeletons the remains of its slaughtered defenders. Wheeler's invasion theory was compelling in its dramatic simplicity, but subsequent research has dismantled it piece by piece. The skeletons he cited were found in different stratigraphic layers, meaning they were not all deposited at the same time. They could not represent a single massacre. Some appeared to have been buried, however informally, rather than left where they fell in the chaos of battle. The evidence for a sudden, catastrophic military assault is thin at best. George Dales, the American archaeologist who re-examined the skeletal evidence in the 1960s, published a paper bluntly titled The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-daro, in which he argued that Wheeler had over-interpreted fragmentary and ambiguous evidence to fit a preconceived narrative. More importantly, the timeline does not support Wheeler's theory. The decline of Mohenjo-daro and of the broader Indus Valley civilization appears to have begun well before the estimated arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking groups in the region, and the process of decline was gradual, unfolding over centuries rather than in a single dramatic episode. Whatever ended Mohenjo-daro, it was not a battle, it was something slower, quieter, and in many ways more frightening. Later researchers turned to environmental explanations. George Dales himself proposed that the city was plagued by repeated catastrophic flooding. The Indus River, one of the great rivers of Asia, is a powerful, unpredictable waterway prone to shifting its course and to devastating floods during the monsoon season. Evidence of flood deposits, layers of water-laid silt and clay, has been found within the archaeological layers at Mohenjo-daro, and the city shows clear evidence of having been rebuilt multiple times after flood damage. Dales proposed that successive floods undermined the city's infrastructure, damaged its buildings, disrupted its agricultural hinterland, and eventually made the location uninhabitable. The people did not die in a massacre. They simply could not keep rebuilding. This theory has considerable merit, but it cannot explain everything. Flooding would account for damage to Mohenjo-daro specifically, but the decline of the Indus Valley civilization was not limited to one city. The entire network of settlements shrank, reorganized, and in many cases was abandoned over a period of several centuries. Sites hundreds of kilometers from the Indus River also showed signs of decline. Something broader was at work, something that affected the entire civilization, not just one flood-prone location. The most recent and most compelling body of research points to large-scale environmental change as the primary driver of the civilization's decline. Studies of ancient sediments, cave formations called speleothems, ocean floor cores from the Arabian Sea, and other paleoclimatic records have converged on a picture of significant climate change in the region around the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The summer monsoon, the seasonal pattern of heavy rainfall that sustains agriculture across South Asia, appears to have weakened substantially during this period. Rainfall decreased. Rivers that had been sustained by monsoon runoff shrank or dried up entirely. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which flowed through the eastern portion of the Indus Valley civilization's territory, and which many scholars identify with the Sarasvati River mentioned in ancient Vedic texts, may have ceased to flow as a perennial river, becoming seasonal or disappearing altogether. Research published in 2012 by Liviu Giosan of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and a team of international collaborators appearing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences provided some of the strongest evidence for this environmental shift. Using satellite imagery, geomorphological analysis, and sediment studies, Giosan and colleagues argued that the Indus Valley civilization had actually thrived not because of the rivers, but because of the monsoon. When the monsoon weakened, the environmental foundation of the civilization crumbled. Crops failed, water supplies dwindled, the agricultural surplus that had sustained urban populations evaporated, cities became unsustainable, people dispersed eastward and southward toward areas that still received enough rainfall to support farming. But in doing so, they abandoned the urban tradition that had defined their civilization. They did not rebuild Mohenjo-Daro in a new location. They simply scattered. But even this explanation, compelling as it is, leaves a crucial gap. Climate change and river shifts were gradual processes, unfolding over decades or centuries, not overnight. A resilient, well-organized civilization, one capable of building Mohenjo-Daro's infrastructure and maintaining standardized systems across 1 million square kilometers, might have been expected to adapt, to relocate, to innovate, to find new solutions to new problems. That is, after all, what civilizations do. And yet, the hallmarks of the Indus Valley civilization, the planned cities, the standard weights, the distinctive seals, the undeciphered script, all of these gradually vanished from the archaeological record. The civilization did not simply relocate and continue under new conditions. It dissolved. The urban tradition ended. The script fell out of use. The cultural identity that had bound millions of people together across vast distances simply evaporated, like water from a shrinking river. Something is deeply wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations respond to stress. We imagine that advanced societies adapt, that they bend rather than break, that their accumulated knowledge and organizational capacity give them the resilience to weather even severe environmental challenges. The Indus Valley civilization should have adapted. It had the organizational capacity, it had the technical skill, it had the geographic range to relocate to more favorable areas. And yet it did not survive as a coherent entity. It fragmented and was absorbed into something else, something smaller, something simpler, something that no longer built great cities, or used the old script, or maintained the old standards. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. We do not know what the people of Mohenjo-Daro knew. We cannot read their writings. We cannot reconstruct their knowledge systems in any detail. It is entirely possible, even probable, that they possessed understandings of hydraulics, urban planning, material science, trade logistics, social organization, or environmental management that were not replicated elsewhere for thousands of years after their civilization ended. And all of that knowledge is gone, not burned in a fire, not destroyed by an enemy, simply lost, dissolved into the silence of unreadable signs carved on small squares of soft stone, carried by no voice, understood by no mind, waiting in the darkness of museum drawers for a reader who may never come. The story of Mohenjo-Daro does not exist in isolation. It sits within a broader, deeply unsettling pattern that stretches across continents and across millennia. The pattern of advanced civilizations that rose, achieved extraordinary things, and then vanished so completely that their very existence was forgotten by the generations that followed. To understand what happened at Mohenjo-daro, to understand why such a thorough erasure is even possible, we need to examine this pattern in its full scope, because the same forces that appear to have erased the Indus Valley civilization appear to have operated across the ancient world, in different places, at different times, under different circumstances, with disturbingly similar results. The first angle of exploration takes us to Göbekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that has fundamentally altered the timeline of human architectural achievement. The site was first noted by a joint survey conducted by the University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago in the 1960s. A team member recorded it as a possible medieval cemetery, nothing more. The mound, covered with broken limestone slabs, was unremarkable to the casual eye. It was not until Klaus Schmidt, an archaeologist from the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin, revisited the site in 1994 that its true significance began to emerge. Schmidt recognized that the stone slabs scattered on the surface were not cemetery markers. They were the tops of massive carved pillars, barely protruding from the soil. He began excavations the following year, in 1995, and what he uncovered over the next 2 decades until his death in 2014 was nothing short of revolutionary. Beneath the surface of the mound, Schmidt and his team found circles of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 15 metric tons. The pillars were arranged in oval or circular enclosures, with 2 larger pillars standing at the center of each ring, facing each other like sentinels. And they were not plain. They were covered with intricate, accomplished reliefs of animals: foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, lions, bulls, spiders, and other creatures, some recognizable, some more abstract. Some pillars bore carved arms and hands along their sides, as if the pillars themselves represented stylized human figures, each one a kind of monumental portrait standing in the earth. According to radiocarbon dating, the oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe were built roughly 11,500 years ago, placing them in a period known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A. This is a staggering date. To contextualize it with comparisons that make the time depth tangible, Göbekli Tepe predates the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza by roughly 7,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years. It predates the earliest known pottery by roughly 2,000 years. It predates the development of agriculture in the region by, according to some estimates, several centuries. This last point is critical. Göbekli Tepe was apparently built by people who were still primarily hunter-gatherers, people who foraged for wild plants and hunted wild animals for their food. They had not yet domesticated crops or livestock. According to the standard models of social development, such people should not have had the organizational capacity, the surplus labor, the engineering knowledge, or the aesthetic sophistication to construct monumental carved stone architecture. But here is the problem. They did construct it. The pillars are there, the carvings are there, the careful, deliberate arrangement of the stone circles is there. The evidence is undeniable, and it is evidence that directly contradicts some of our most fundamental assumptions about the relationship between economic complexity, in this case agriculture, and cultural achievement, in this case monumental architecture. The standard model says you need agriculture first, to produce the food surplus that frees people from the daily work of finding food, allowing them to specialize as builders, artists, and priests. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the relationship may have been more complex, or even reverse it. Schmidt himself proposed that the desire to build Göbekli Tepe, the cultural and spiritual imperative to create this monumental site, may have actually driven the development of agriculture in the region, rather than the other way around. People gathered to build, and the need to feed the builders forced them to develop more reliable food sources. And then something else happened. Something that connects Göbekli Tepe to Mohenjo-daro in a way that is profoundly troubling. The site was deliberately buried, Around 9,000 years ago, the stone circles at Göbekli Tepe were intentionally filled in with soil, rubble, animal bones, and stone tools. The pillars were covered, the carvings were hidden. The entire site was concealed beneath a mound of debris that would remain undisturbed for thousands of years. The burial appears to have been careful and deliberate, not the result of natural erosion or haphazard abandonment. Someone, at some point, decided that Göbekli Tepe should be hidden. Whether this was an act of reverence, of ritual closure, of protection against some perceived danger, or of simple forgetting by a later generation that no longer understood the site's purpose, we cannot say with certainty. The motives are as lost as the culture that created the site. What we know is that the burial was thorough. For roughly 9,000 years, one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the ancient world lay hidden beneath a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, unknown to anyone who lived, worked, or walked above it. The implications of this deliberate burial are worth pausing over. Knowledge does not simply disappear because a people abandons a site. It disappears because the chain of transmission, the oral tradition, the apprenticeship, the ritual practice that carried the understanding from generation to generation is broken. At Göbekli Tepe, that chain was broken so completely that not only was the knowledge of how to build such structures lost, but even the memory that they had ever been built was erased. The site was buried, and the burial itself was forgotten. Two layers of forgetting, one on top of the other, like geological strata in the earth. The builders of Göbekli Tepe knew things. They knew how to quarry limestone bedrock. They knew how to shape massive T-shaped pillars with stone tools. They knew how to carve intricate animal reliefs with a precision and confidence that suggests either natural genius or, more likely, a long tradition of craft knowledge passed down through apprenticeship. They knew how to organize the labor of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of workers toward a common goal. They knew how to conceive of and execute a monumental architectural project in a landscape where no permanent structures had existed before. All of that knowledge, every technique, every tradition, every understanding was lost. Not in a catastrophe, not in a war, simply through the slow, quiet attrition of forgetting. The parallel to Mohenjo-Daro is instructive and deeply concerning. In both cases, we have physical evidence of capabilities that challenge the prevailing assumptions about what people of that era could accomplish. In both cases, the meaning and purpose behind the physical evidence is largely or entirely inaccessible to us. And in both cases, the site was eventually abandoned and forgotten, lost to human memory for thousands of years. The pattern is hauntingly consistent: achievement, abandonment, erasure, silence. The second angle of exploration takes us across the Atlantic to the American Southwest and to the ancestral Puebloan people, formerly referred to by the Navajo term Anasazi, a word that has fallen out of favor because of its connotations. Between roughly 850 and 1300 of the Common Era, the ancestral Puebloans constructed an extraordinary network of settlements across the Four Corners region of what is now the United States, with the cultural and perhaps political center located in Chaco Canyon, a shallow arid canyon in northwestern New Mexico. Within this canyon and in the surrounding region, the Chacoans built a series of great houses, massive multi-story stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, connected by an elaborate system of formal roads that ran in straight lines for dozens of kilometers across the desert terrain, ignoring topography rather than following it, suggesting that the roads served a ceremonial or symbolic purpose beyond mere transportation. The largest of these great houses is Pueblo Bonito, which, at its peak, contained an estimated 600 to 800 rooms, rose 4 or 5 stories high, and covered nearly 2 acres of ground. It was the largest building in North America until the construction of apartment buildings in New York City in the 1880s, a span of roughly 800 years, during which no one on the continent built anything larger. The construction of Pueblo Bonito and its companion structures required the transport of over 200,000 timber beams, many of which were hauled by hand from conifer forests in mountain ranges more than 75 kilometers away. The engineering precision of the construction is notable. Walls were built with a distinctive technique called core and veneer masonry, with a rubble core faced with carefully shaped and fitted sandstone blocks. The alignment of certain structures with solar and lunar events suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Chacoan system, as archaeologists refer to the broader network of great houses, roads, and associated features, displayed many of the same characteristics we see at Mohenjo-Daro. Standardized building techniques used across a large territory, evidence of long-distance trade networks bringing turquoise, macaw feathers, copper bells, and cacao from as far away as Mesoamerica, and a social organization that remains poorly understood despite decades of intensive research. The Chacoans left no written records. Their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, preserve rich oral traditions, but the precise nature of Chacoan political and religious life, the specific mechanisms by which such a vast construction program was organized and sustained, remains a subject of active and sometimes heated scholarly debate. And then it ended. By roughly 1200 of the Common Era, the great houses of Chaco Canyon had been largely abandoned. Populations dispersed to smaller, more defensible settlements on mesa tops and in cliff alcoves across the region. Sites like Mesa Verde, with its famous cliff dwellings, represent a later phase of Puebloan life in which communities literally retreated into crevices in canyon walls, a choice that many archaeologists interpret as a response to increasing conflict, resource scarcity, or both. By 1300, even these cliff dwellings had been abandoned, and the populations had relocated further south and east, to the areas where their descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, live today. The numbers are striking when you compare these collapses. The Chacoan system, from its first stirrings to its abandonment, lasted roughly 450 years. The mature phase of the Indus Valley civilization, from its emergence to its dissolution, lasted roughly 700 years. Both are substantial spans of time by human standards. 700 years ago from our present moment takes us back to the early 14th century, the time of Dante and the beginning of the Renaissance. 450 years ago takes us to the late 16th century, the era of Shakespeare, and the early colonization of the Americas. In both cases, the entire arc of a major civilization, from its blossoming to its disappearance, fits within a span that is shorter than the gap between us and the late medieval period. The effort of building these civilizations took generations. The process of dissolution took fewer. The third angle takes us to Southeast Asia and to the Khmer Empire, specifically to the city of Angkor, in what is now the Kingdom of Cambodia. At its zenith in the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, Angkor was among the largest urban complexes on the planet, covering an estimated area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, a sprawl that dwarfed any contemporary European city. Its population may have reached somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million inhabitants, though the precise figure is debated. The Temple of Angkor Wat, constructed under King Suryavarman II in the first half of the 12th century, remains to this day the largest religious monument on Earth. Its proportions, its sculptural decoration, its precise east-west orientation, and the vast moat that surrounds it all speak to a civilization of immense wealth, technical capability, and aesthetic ambition. But the Khmer achievement that most closely parallels Mohenjo-Daro was not its temples, it was its water. The Khmer built one of the most ambitious and complex hydraulic engineering systems in the pre-industrial world, a network of enormous reservoirs called barrays, the largest of which, the West Barray, measured roughly 8 kilometers long and 2.1 kilometers wide, and held an estimated volume of more than 50 million cubic meters of water. Canals, channels, dikes, and distribution networks connected these reservoirs to the surrounding agricultural land, creating a managed landscape capable of sustaining intensive rice cultivation and supporting a population of extraordinary density for a pre-industrial society. This water management system was the heart of the Khmer Empire. It made Angkor possible. Without it, the dense population, the monumental construction, the elaborate religious life, none of it could have been sustained in the tropical environment of the Tonle Sap floodplain. The system transformed a seasonal landscape of alternating flood and drought into a reliably productive agricultural zone that could feed hundreds of thousands of people year after year. And then the system failed. Research over the past 2 decades much of it using technologies that would have astonished earlier generations of archaeologists, has begun to reveal the mechanisms of Angkor's decline. In 2012, Damien Evans and a team of collaborators used airborne LiDAR, laser scanning from aircraft, to map the full extent of the Angkor urban complex, stripping away the forest canopy that had hidden the ruins and revealing a vast, intricate landscape of canals, reservoirs, roads, and settlement features that had been invisible from the ground. This survey, and subsequent ones in 2015 and later, showed that the Khmer water management system was even more extensive and more complex than previously imagined. It also showed evidence of catastrophic failure. Studies of tree rings, sediment cores, and speleothems from caves in the region have painted a picture of climate instability in the 14th and 15th centuries. Extreme droughts, some lasting years, alternated with periods of unusually intense monsoon rainfall. These oscillations stressed the water management system in ways it was not designed to handle. During droughts, the reservoirs ran low and could not supply enough water for agriculture. During extreme monsoon seasons, the system was overwhelmed by floods that breached dikes, silted up canals, and damaged the carefully maintained network of channels and distribution points. Repairs were attempted, visible in the archaeological record as patches and modifications to canal walls and embankments, but the damage accumulated faster than it could be fixed. The system that had sustained the Khmer Empire for centuries gradually ceased to function. The parallel to Mohenjo-Daro is almost unnervingly precise. In both cases, a civilization built extraordinary water management infrastructure that was central to its survival and its identity. In both cases, that infrastructure required constant maintenance and represented a vast accumulation of engineering knowledge. And in both cases, environmental changes, specifically shifts in rainfall patterns and water availability, undermined the very systems that the civilization depended upon for its existence. The technology that enabled their rise became, through changing circumstances, the vulnerability that ensured their decline. The fourth angle of exploration plunges us into one of the most dramatic and least understood catastrophes in all of recorded history: the Bronze Age collapse. In the late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 years before the Common Era, the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a cascading failure so thorough that it took centuries for the region to recover. Within a span of roughly 50 years, starting around 1177, before the Common Era, virtually every major political entity in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed outright or was catastrophically weakened. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled much of Anatolia and northern Syria for centuries, and had fought the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, ceased to exist. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palace centres of mainland Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the Trojan War legend, collapsed one after another. Pylos burned. Mycenae shrank to a fraction of its former size. Tiryns was damaged and diminished. The great trading city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria was destroyed and never rebuilt. The last letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, baked hard by the fire that consumed the city, contains a desperate plea for military aid from the king, who wrote that enemy ships had been sighted offshore. No aid came. Ugarit was destroyed and its civilization ended. The archives of Ugarit, clay tablets bearing texts in multiple languages, survived only because the very fire that destroyed the city also hardened the soft clay into permanent form. The literary and diplomatic texts recovered from those archives have proved invaluable to modern scholarship, but they also serve as a brutal reminder at countless other sites where fire did not preserve the records, or where records were kept on perishable papyrus or leather, everything was lost. The scale of the Bronze Age collapse is genuinely staggering. Within the span of a single human lifetime, an entire international order disintegrated. A system of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependency that had connected Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Cypriots, the Canaanite city-states, and the Mesopotamian kingdoms was torn apart. The trade in tin and copper, the two metals whose combination produced bronze and gave the era its name, was disrupted so severely that bronze tools and weapons became scarce. Without reliable access to metal, agricultural productivity declined. Without agricultural surplus, populations shrank. The cascading failures fed upon one another, each crisis deepening the next, creating a downward spiral that no single state or alliance could arrest. The centuries that followed, known in Greek history as the Dark Ages, saw a dramatic simplification of material culture, a sharp decline in population, and the loss of literacy across the Aegean. The Greeks forgot how to write. Their Linear B script, used by the Mycenaean palace bureaucracies, fell out of use entirely and would not be deciphered until Michael Ventris cracked it in 1952, 3,000 years after the last scribe set down his stylus. Egypt survived, but barely. The pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties, Merneptah and Ramesses III, fought off repeated attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples, coalitions of warriors and migrants whose origins remain the subject of furious scholarly debate. Ramesses III recorded his victories over the Sea Peoples on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, and the reliefs there provide some of the most detailed depictions of ancient naval warfare that survive. But the effort of defending against these incursions exhausted Egypt, and the new kingdom declined rapidly in the generations that followed. Eric Klein, an archaeologist at George Washington University, examined this catastrophe in detail in his 2014 work on the subject. Klein argued persuasively that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by any single factor, but by the simultaneous failure of multiple interconnected systems. Drought and famine reduced agricultural output. Earthquakes damaged cities and infrastructure. Long-distance trade networks, which had bound the eastern Mediterranean into a complex web of economic interdependence, were disrupted, possibly by the Sea Peoples, possibly by political instability, probably by both. Internal rebellions and social upheavals, sparked by famine and inequality, weakened states from within. Each stress amplified the others, creating a cascading failure that no single kingdom or empire could withstand. The relevance to Mohenjo-Daro is profound and specific. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that even civilizations with armies, with writing, with diplomatic networks, with centuries of accumulated institutional knowledge, with the ability to record their own history and call upon their allies, can collapse when the systems that support them are hit by multiple stresses simultaneously. The Indus Valley civilization, which appears to have lacked many of the military and diplomatic institutions that the Bronze Age kingdoms possessed, may have been even more vulnerable to this kind of systemic failure. It had no army, as far as we know, to defend its trade routes. It had no diplomatic corps to negotiate with neighbouring powers. It had, it seems, only its cultural consensus, its shared standards, its communal infrastructure, and when the environmental foundation shifted, when the monsoons weakened and the rivers changed their courses, that consensus was not enough to hold. The fifth and final angle of exploration carries us to the heart of North America and to the city of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, located near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now the state of Illinois, just across the river from present-day St. Louis. At its peak, around 1050 to 1100 of the Common Era, Cahokia was a genuine city, holding a population that may have reached between 15,000 and 20,000 people, a number that made it larger than London at the same period in history. The centerpiece of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, an enormous earthen platform that stands roughly 30 meters high and covers an area of approximately 6 hectares at its base, making it the largest earthen structure in the Americas and one of the largest in the world. The construction of Monk's Mound required the movement of an estimated 760,000 cubic meters of earth, all carried one basket load at a time by human laborers. Around this central mound, more than 120 additional mounds of various sizes and shapes were arranged across a landscape of roughly 13 square kilometers. A grand central plaza, roughly 19 hectares in extent, stretched out before Monk's Mound, providing a gathering space that could have held tens of thousands of people. A wooden palisade wall with guard towers surrounded the central precinct. A circle of large wooden posts, dubbed Woodhenge by archaeologists in analogy to Stonehenge, appears to have functioned as a solar calendar with specific posts aligned to the solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia was the center of what archaeologists call the Mississippian cultural tradition, a widespread pattern of mound building, maize agriculture, and elaborate ceremonial life that extended across much of the eastern and central portions of North America, from roughly 800 to 1500 of the Common Era. The city drew materials and goods from across a vast trade network: copper from the Great Lakes region, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shirt from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, mica from the Appalachian Mountains. The concentration of exotic goods and the scale of the monumental construction speak to a society of considerable complexity, one with the organizational capacity to mobilize large labor forces, manage long-distance trade, and sustain a dense urban population in an era long before European contact. And then, sometime around 1300 of the Common Era, Cahokia was empty. The population had been declining steadily for over a century before the final abandonment. By 1200, the rate of new construction had slowed dramatically. By 1250, the population had fallen sharply. By 1300, the city was a ghost town, its mounds overgrown with grass and scrub, its plazas silent, its wooden structures rotting in the river valley humidity. The causes of Cahokia's decline are debated with the same intensity and the same ultimate uncertainty as the causes of Mohenjo-Daro's collapse. Environmental degradation, including massive deforestation of the surrounding uplands to fuel construction and heating, leading to erosion, flooding, and soil exhaustion, is one leading candidate. Studies of sediment cores from nearby Horseshoe Lake have revealed evidence of catastrophic flooding events that deposited thick layers of silt across the floodplain, events that would have disrupted agriculture and damaged the low-lying portions of the city. The forest clearance was particularly devastating because the timber was needed not just for heating and cooking, but for the palisade wall that surrounded the central precinct, a wall that was rebuilt at least 4 times during the city's history, each time requiring the felling and transport of thousands of large trees. The deforestation destabilized the hillsides above the city, increasing runoff and erosion during heavy rains and reducing the fertility of the soil that fed the population. Climate change played a role as well. Cahokia's rise coincided with a period of relatively warm, stable weather, known as the medieval climate anomaly, which favored the intensive maize agriculture that sustained the city. As the climate shifted toward the cooler, more variable conditions of the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1250 of the Common Era, growing seasons shortened, crop yields became less predictable, and the agricultural surplus that had supported a dense urban population diminished. Without reliable food, the social contracts that held the community together began to fray. Political and social factors likely compounded the environmental pressures. There is archaeological evidence of increasing social tension in Cahokia's later years, including the construction of a massive wooden palisade wall with bastions clearly designed for defense. The question of what the inhabitants were defending against, external enemies or internal unrest, remains open. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of human sacrifice at Cahokia, including a mass burial known as Mound 72 that contained the remains of over 270 individuals, many of them young women who appear to have been killed and buried together. If such practices were part of the political or religious system that sustained Cahokia, their social costs may eventually have become unsustainable, provoking resistance, flight, or both. What is not debated is the completeness of the forgetting. When European explorers and settlers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found the mounds, but they could not believe that indigenous peoples had built them. The sheer scale of the earthworks, the precision of their placement, the evident planning behind their arrangement, all of this seemed, to European eyes, incompatible with the peoples they encountered living in the region. So they invented alternative explanations. The mounds were attributed to a lost race of giants, to refugees from Atlantis, to wandering Phoenician sailors, to the lost tribes of Israel, to anyone, in short, except the actual descendants of the people who had built them. The erasure of Cahokia was not just physical, but intellectual. Not only was the city abandoned and forgotten, but the very capacity of its builders was denied by those who came after. The pattern across all 5 of these cases, Mohenjo-Daro, Göbekli Tepe, Chaco Canyon, Angkor, and Cahokia, is consistent and deeply unsettling in its consistency. Advanced societies, societies that invested enormous resources in architecture and infrastructure and social coordination, can and do collapse. They do not simply shrink or decline in a graceful, managed way. They lose their distinctive characteristics. Their technologies are abandoned. Their knowledge systems break down. Their social cohesion dissolves. And in the worst cases, their very existence is erased from human memory as completely and as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. But the problem is not simply that these collapses happen. The problem is that we consistently fail to see them coming while they are happening, and we consistently fail to learn the right lessons from them once they have happened. Each of these civilizations, in its own way, believed it was building for permanence. The bricks of Mohenjo-Daro were fired for durability. The stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe were carved from bedrock. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were built with walls thick enough to last centuries. The temples of Angkor were dressed in sandstone and consecrated to eternal gods. And yet none of these constructions saved the societies that created them. The buildings survived in some form, however damaged by time and weather and neglect. The civilizations did not. This brings us back to Mohenjo-Daro with renewed urgency and renewed disquiet, because the Indus Valley civilization is not just one more entry in a catalogue of fallen societies. It is, in many important respects, the most disturbing case of all. It is the most disturbing because of its scale, covering a territory larger than any of the others we have examined. It is the most disturbing because of its apparent sophistication, with infrastructure that genuinely outpaced much of the rest of the world by thousands of years. It is the most disturbing because of the apparent egalitarianism of its social structure, which suggests that its collapse was not driven by the kind of elite exploitation and popular revolt that can explain the downfall of more hierarchical societies. And it is the most disturbing because of the absolute completeness of its erasure. We cannot read the Indus script. We cannot hear the Indus voice. We have the bones of a civilization, but none of its soul, none of its self-understanding, none of the stories it told about itself. And it is the most disturbing because of the absolute completeness of its erasure. We cannot read the Indus script. We cannot hear the Indus voice. We have the bones of a civilization, but none of its soul, none of its self-understanding, none of the stories it told about itself. There is a further dimension to this pattern that deserves examination, and it concerns the role of complexity itself as a source of vulnerability. Each of the civilizations we have examined tonight was, in its own way, a complex system, a web of interconnected social, economic, technological, and environmental relationships that sustained a way of life far more elaborate than what came before, or, in most cases, what came after. The Indus Valley civilization depended on the monsoon for its agriculture, on the rivers for its water supply, on long-distance trade for its luxury goods and raw materials, and on some form of social consensus or institutional authority for the maintenance of its extraordinary urban infrastructure. Each of these dependencies represented a potential point of failure, and when multiple points failed simultaneously or in rapid succession, the system as a whole could not adapt quickly enough to survive. This is the paradox of complexity. The very features that make a civilization impressive, its elaborate infrastructure, its extensive trade networks, its specialized workforce, its reliance on advanced technology, are also the features that make it fragile. A simple farming village is resilient because it depends on very little beyond the immediate environment. A complex city is fragile because it depends on everything: reliable water, functioning sewers, maintained roads, steady food supply, social order, shared cultural norms, and the continuous transmission of the specialized knowledge needed to keep all of these systems operating. Remove any one of these supports and the system degrades. Remove several at once and it can collapse entirely. Joseph Tainter, an anthropologist and historian, explored this dynamic in his influential 1988 study of societal collapse. Tainter argued that complex societies collapse because the returns on complexity diminish over time. In the early stages of a civilization's development, investments in complexity, in bureaucracy, in infrastructure, in military defense yield high returns in terms of productivity, security, and social cohesion. But over time, the costs of maintaining and expanding that complexity increase, while the returns plateau or decline. Eventually, the society reaches a point where additional complexity no longer produces benefits proportional to its costs. At that point, the society becomes vulnerable to shocks, external or internal, that a less complex system would absorb more easily. The result is not always a sudden collapse. More often, it is a process of simplification, in which the society gradually sheds its most complex and costly features, including its cities, its writing systems, its standardized practices, and its long-distance trade, and reverts to a simpler, less costly, but also less impressive mode of existence. Tainter's model fits the Indus Valley case with uncomfortable precision. The standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the maintained drainage systems, the long-distance trade networks, all of these were complex, costly features that required sustained investment of labor, materials, and organizational energy. When the environmental foundation of the civilization shifted, when the monsoons weakened and the rivers changed course, the costs of maintaining this complexity would have risen sharply, while the benefits, in terms of agricultural productivity and trade revenue, would have declined. At some point, the equation tipped and the civilization began to simplify. Cities were abandoned, standards were relaxed. The script, which was useful only in the context of a complex, literate, commercially active urban society, fell out of use when that society ceased to exist. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the permanence of human achievement, about the stability of human knowledge, about the reliability of human progress. The evidence from Mohenjo-Daro and from the broader pattern of civilizational collapse and erasure that we have traced across 5 continents and thousands of years suggests that advancement is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary state, maintained only so long as the systems that support it, the environmental conditions, the social structures, the institutions of knowledge transmission remain intact. When those systems fail, whether through environmental change, social fragmentation, institutional decay, or some combination of these forces, the result is not a step backward, it is an erasure. And the deeper the achievement, the more profound and more painful the loss when it finally comes. There is a thought experiment that captures the gravity of what has happened at Mohenjo-Daro, and it is worth dwelling on, turning over slowly in the mind, like a polished stone found in a ruin. Imagine that every book, every digital file, every recording, every database, every inscription produced by modern civilization were suddenly rendered unreadable. Not destroyed, understand, but unreadable. The books still sit on their shelves. The hard drives still spin in their server farms. The clay tablets and stone inscriptions still stand in their original positions. But no one alive can decipher the script. No one alive can read a single word. Everything we have built, every law we have written, every scientific formula we have derived, every medical protocol, every engineering manual, every poem, every recipe, every love letter, every tax record, every treaty, every birth certificate, every death notice, every advertisement, every warning label, all of it reduced to meaningless marks on meaningless surfaces. That is the situation we are in with the Indus Valley civilization. Their writings survive. Their words are physically present in the world, pressed into fired clay, carved into polished stone, stamped onto small seals that were once pressed into soft clay or wax to authenticate goods and mark ownership. The messages exist. We can photograph them. We can hold the objects that carry them in our hands. We can feel the grooves where a carver's tool bit into the steatite 4,000 years ago. But we cannot read them. The sounds those symbols represent, the meanings they encode, the thoughts they were meant to convey, all of that is as lost to us as if the seals had never been carved at all. Let that sink in. This is not science fiction. This is not a hypothetical scenario designed to provoke anxiety. This is the actual, literal, documented state of our knowledge about one of the largest, most geographically extensive, and most materially sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. We have their infrastructure, we have their artifacts, we have their writing, and we understand almost none of it at the level that truly matters, the level of meaning, of purpose, of intention, of human thought and human feeling. The deeper truth that Mohenjo-Daro reveals, the truth that lies beneath the individual mysteries and specific archaeological puzzles, is about the fragility of knowledge itself. We tend to think of knowledge as cumulative. This is one of the foundational assumptions of modern life. Each generation, we believe, learns what the previous generation knew, adds its own discoveries and innovations, and passes the whole package on to the generation that follows. Over time, the store of human knowledge grows steadily, like a snowball rolling downhill, getting larger and larger with each revolution. This is the model of progress that underlies most of our thinking about history, about education, about the future. We assume that what we know today will still be known tomorrow, and that tomorrow we will know even more. But the evidence from the Indus Valley, and from every other collapsed civilization we have examined tonight, tells a very different story. Knowledge is not automatically cumulative. It is not a snowball that grows on its own. It is more like a flame that must be actively tended. It is maintained only through constant, deliberate effort, through institutions that preserve it, through languages that carry it, through teaching traditions that transmit it, through social structures that value it and fund it and protect it. When those institutions, languages, traditions, and social structures fail, when they are disrupted or degraded or simply allowed to atrophy through neglect, knowledge does not sit patiently on a shelf waiting to be rediscovered. It vanishes, it goes out, the flame dies. Consider what was lost when the Indus script fell out of use. We do not know the Harappan word for water, the substance that their entire civilization was built around. We do not know their word for home, though we have excavated hundreds of their houses. We do not know their word for bread, though we have found the granaries where they presumably stored their grain. We do not know their words for mother, father, child, friend, stranger, enemy. We do not know what they called the river that sustained them, the same river that flooded and threatened, and ultimately may have helped destroy their greatest city. We do not know what stories they told their children at bedtime, if they told such stories. We do not know what songs they sang at harvest time, if they sang at all. We do not know what prayers or invocations they offered at the Great Bath, if prayers were what they offered. We do not know the names of the architects who designed their sewer systems, arguably one of the most practically impressive feats of engineering in the entire ancient world. We do not know the name of a single person who lived in Mohenjo-Daro across the entire span of its existence. Not one name, not a single individual, from the first brick laid to the last person who walked away and never returned. Let that sink in. An entire civilization, spanning at least 7 centuries in its mature phase, and probably much longer in its developmental stages, covering more than 1 million square kilometers of territory, home at its peak to perhaps 5 million living, breathing, thinking, feeling human beings, and we do not know a single one of their names. We do not even know what they called their own city. Mohenjo-Daro is not their word. Mound of the Dead is a label applied by people who came thousands of years later, people who saw only a dusty hill and had no idea what lay beneath it. The people who built this city, who walked its straight streets and bathed in its great bath and traded with merchants from Mesopotamia, they called it something else, something that meant something to them, something that is now gone. This is a kind of death that goes beyond physical destruction. It is deeper than the crumbling of walls or the shattering of pottery. It is an annihilation of identity. The people of the Indus Valley are not just physically absent from the world. They are conceptually absent. They have been reduced to their material products, objects in museum display cases, data points in archaeological databases, bricks in a wall, drains in a street. They are defined entirely by what they made, never by who they were. And the gap between those two things, between the material evidence and the human meaning, is the gap that the Indus script guards in its unbreakable silence. There is a further dimension to this loss that deserves careful exploration because it connects the fate of Mohenjo-Daro to a recurring pattern in human history that extends far beyond the Indus Valley. The Indus Valley civilization did not exist in isolation. It was part of a network of ancient societies connected by trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Indus Valley seals and trade goods have been found at sites in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from the Akkadian period, roughly 2300 to 2100 years before the Common Era, refer to a distant land called Meluha. Most scholars believe that Meluha was the Indus Valley civilization, or at least the portion of it that engaged in maritime trade with the Persian Gulf region. These texts describe Meluha as a source of exotic and desirable goods: red carnelian beads, ivory, timber, lapis lazuli, gold, and a material sometimes translated as black wood. A particularly evocative reference comes from the reign of Sargon of Akkad, one of the earliest empire builders in Mesopotamian history. A text attributed to Sargon boasts that ships from Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun, three foreign trading partners, docked at the quays of his capital city. The mention of Meluha alongside Magan, usually identified with the Oman Peninsula, and Dilmun, identified with Bahrain, places the Indus Valley civilization within a web of maritime commerce that spanned the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, connecting three of the major civilizations of the ancient world. But here is the painful asymmetry that defines our relationship with the Indus Valley. The Mesopotamians wrote about their trade with Meluha. We can read those accounts. We know, in fragmentary form, what the Mesopotamians thought of the Indus Valley and what goods they sought from it. But the Indus Valley's own account of this relationship, its perspective on the trade, its understanding of its own place in the wider world, its evaluation of the Mesopotamians and the other peoples it dealt with, all of this is locked behind the undeciphered script. We have one side of a conversation that lasted centuries. The other side is silence. The deeper truth extends still further. The knowledge lost at Mohenjo-Daro was not an isolated incident. It was part of a recurring, deeply disturbing pattern in which entire bodies of human knowledge, painstakingly accumulated over centuries or millennia, are destroyed or rendered inaccessible by events that their creators could not prevent and often could not even foresee. The ancient library of Alexandria, whatever its true size and organizational structure, represented an enormous concentration of classical learning. Its gradual destruction and dispersal over the centuries, through fire, neglect, war, and institutional decay, erased an incalculable quantity of ancient knowledge. Scholars have estimated that we possess, today, perhaps 5% of the literature produced in classical antiquity. 95% is gone. Lost plays by Sophocles and Euripides, lost histories, lost philosophical treatises, lost mathematical proofs, lost scientific observations, all gone. The Maya provide another devastating example. Before the Spanish conquest of the 16th century, the Maya possessed a sophisticated writing system, one of the few fully developed scripts produced independently in the ancient Americas. They used this script to record their history, their astronomy, their mathematics, their religious rituals, and their understanding of the world. They inscribed it on stone monuments. They painted it on ceramic vessels, and they wrote it in folding books made of bark paper and covered in lime plaster, books known as codices. When the Spanish arrived, Bishop Diego de Landa of Yucatan, in an act of cultural vandalism that is difficult to comprehend across the centuries, ordered the collection and burning of Maya codices. Thousands of volumes, the accumulated written heritage of an entire civilization, were reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Only 4 Maya codices are known to survive today. 4 out of what may have been tens of thousands, an entire civilization's literary heritage, spanning centuries, reduced to 4 fragile documents in 4 different museums, each one irreplaceable, each one a fragment of a lost whole. The irony of Landa's destruction is bitter and instructive. Landa himself later attempted to document the Maya writing system, recording an account of the Maya alphabet as he understood it. His account, preserved in a manuscript known as the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, would prove crucial to the eventual decipherment of the Maya script in the 20th century. The man who destroyed the books also preserved one of the keys to reading them. But the books themselves, the actual content, the stories and histories, and astronomical observations and mathematical calculations they contained, are gone forever. Landa saved the alphabet but burned the library. The ancient world of the Near East suffered a different kind of textual loss. one that is less dramatic but perhaps equally significant. The great cuneiform archives of Mesopotamia, preserved on clay tablets that survived the millennia precisely because they were baked hard in the fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them, represent an enormous body of ancient learning. But the ability to read cuneiform was lost for roughly 2,000 years, from the last centuries before the Common Era, when cuneiform fell out of use, until the mid-19th century, when scholars such as Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks cracked the script. During those 2,000 years, the tablets existed, physically present in the ruins, but they were as unreadable as the Indus seals are to us today. The difference is that cuneiform was eventually deciphered, thanks largely to the existence of multilingual inscriptions and a substantial corpus of long texts. The Indus script offers neither of these advantages. The pattern that connects these losses, from the Indus Valley to Alexandria to the Maya heartland to the long silence of cuneiform, is consistent and deeply revealing. Knowledge is always concentrated in specific scripts, in specific languages, in specific institutions, in specific physical media. This concentration makes the knowledge vulnerable. When the script becomes unreadable, the knowledge locked within it becomes inaccessible. When the library burns, the books are gone. When the codices are thrown into the fire, the stories they contained die with them. The lesson is always the same. Knowledge that is concentrated is knowledge that can be lost, and knowledge that can be lost will, eventually, be lost. What makes the Indus Valley case uniquely painful is that the knowledge was not actively destroyed by any external agent that we can identify. No conqueror burned the Indus archives, if archives existed. No fanatic smashed the Indus tablets or threw the Indus books into the fire. The knowledge simply became inaccessible as the people who could read the script diminished in number, generation by generation, until eventually the last reader died and took their understanding with them. The loss was passive, gradual, silent, invisible to those who lived through it, because each generation presumably lost only a little more than it had received, and no single generation experienced a dramatic enough decline to sound an alarm. This passive, gradual form of knowledge loss is in many ways far more terrifying than active, violent destruction. Active destruction implies an enemy, an identifiable cause, a force that can potentially be resisted, fought, or punished. Passive loss implies nothing except the slow, quiet retreat of competence, the imperceptible fading of skill, the gentle dimming of understanding, as each generation transmits slightly less than it received. One generation forgets a few signs, the next forgets a few more. Within a handful of generations, the chain of understanding is broken, and no one alive can restore it. No one even realizes that anything has been lost, because by the time the loss becomes apparent, there is no one left who remembers what was there to begin with. We are not immune to this process. We would like to believe that we are. We have digital archives, international preservation organizations, redundant storage systems, translation software, and a global academic community dedicated to the conservation and transmission of knowledge. These are real and valuable protections, and they represent a genuine advance over anything the Harappans possessed. But they are also, in their own way, fragile. They depend on electricity, on functioning computer networks, on the continued availability of rare earth minerals for manufacturing electronic components, on the stability of the political and economic systems that fund research and maintain infrastructure. If any of these supporting systems were disrupted on a large enough scale for a long enough time, the vast majority of our digitally stored knowledge would become as inaccessible as the Indus script, not destroyed, just unreadable, locked behind file formats that no available software can open, stored on media that no available hardware can read. This is not science fiction. This is a structural vulnerability that exists in our knowledge systems at this very moment. The Indus Valley civilization demonstrated, more than 4,000 years ago, that a sophisticated, well-organized society can lose its entire textual heritage in the space of a few generations. We have built our own civilization on foundations that are, in crucial respects, even more fragile than theirs. Our knowledge is stored on media whose functional lifespan is measured in decades, not centuries. Our languages of digital storage, our file formats and encoding standards change so frequently that data stored in formats common 30 years ago can be extremely difficult to access today. We are building elaborate, magnificent structures of knowledge on platforms made of sand, and we are calling those platforms permanent. The deeper truth of Mohenjo-Daro is ultimately not about the past, as much as we might wish it were. It is about the present. It is about the illusion of permanence that we wrap around ourselves like a blanket. The comfortable, reassuring belief that what we have built will endure because we are advanced enough and clever enough and organ enough to prevent the kind of collapse that befell the Harappans. But the Harappans were clever. They were advanced. They were organized. They built sanitation systems that outperformed those of industrial London by 4,000 years. They coordinated a standardized civilization across more than 1 million square kilometers. And they are gone. Their script is unread. Their names are unknown. Their city is a slowly dissolving ruin in a salt-eaten floodplain. There is one more layer to this truth, and it is perhaps the most profound of all. The people of Mohenjo-Daro did not know that they were going to be forgotten. They built their city with the same confidence and the same assumption of continuity that we bring to our own building. They laid their bricks, dug their drains, carved their seals, loaded their merchant ships, calibrated their weights, raised their children, argued with their neighbors, grieved their dead, and at no point in this long human process did they presumably imagine that all of it, every last bit of it, would one day be reduced to silent mounds in a desert floodplain. They did not know that their language would become mute. They did not know that their names would be forgotten. They did not know that the very word people would one day use to refer to their city would translate to Mound of the Dead, a name given not in honor but in ignorance. No civilization believes that it is mortal. That is the deepest truth that Mohenjo-Daro has to teach, and it is a truth that the city has been speaking in its silent, crumbling, incomprehensible way for nearly 5,000 years to anyone willing to listen. What does it mean to live in a world where civilizations of this scope and sophistication can be so thoroughly erased that even their names are lost? This is not an abstract philosophical exercise, the kind of question one poses at academic conferences and then sets aside over dinner. It is a practical question with immediate implications, a question whose answer reaches into the present moment and extends forward into a future that we are shaping right now with every decision we make about what to preserve and what to neglect. The first and most fundamental implication is humility. The discovery of the Indus Valley civilization, and of Mohenjo-Daro in particular, should serve as a deep, structural corrective to the assumption that the modern world represents the highest point humanity has ever reached. We are accustomed to a particular narrative of history, one in which the general trend is upward and forward. Each century, we believe, brings new discoveries, new technologies, new capacities that make us more powerful and more knowledgeable than those who came before us. This narrative is not entirely wrong. In many domains, particularly in science, medicine, and technology, the progress of the past few centuries has been genuinely extraordinary. But the narrative is incomplete, and the incompleteness is dangerous, because it breeds a complacency about the permanence of our achievements that the historical record does not support. 4,600 years ago, according to current archaeological estimates, people in the Indus Valley were building cities with planned drainage and sanitation systems that much of the modern world would not match for millennia. They were using standardized weights and measures across territories equivalent in size to Western Europe. They were producing luxury goods, carnelian beads of extraordinary craftsmanship, shell ornaments, bronze tools that were traded across thousands of kilometers of land and sea. They were coordinating the activities of millions of people without, as far as we can determine, the coercive apparatus of a royal court or a standing army. These were not primitive people fumbling toward the light of civilization. These were accomplished, sophisticated, highly capable people who had solved problems of urban living that later societies would struggle with for millennia. And they are gone. Their achievements did not protect them. Their sophistication did not save them. Their organization did not prevent their dissolution. The lesson is painful but necessary. Achievement does not guarantee survival. Sophistication does not confer permanence. We are not protected from the forces that brought down the Indus Valley civilization simply because we can fly in airplanes and split atoms and send signals around the world at the speed of light. Those capabilities, impressive as they are, rest on supporting systems that are themselves vulnerable to disruption. Power grids can fail, supply chains can break, communication networks can go dark. The question is not whether our technology is more advanced than the Harappans' technology. Of course it is. The question is whether our understanding of our own vulnerabilities is more advanced than theirs. And on that count, the evidence is not encouraging. The second implication concerns what we choose to value, what we choose to preserve, and what we allow to decay through indifference and neglect. The Indus Valley civilization, as far as the archaeological evidence can tell us, prioritized communal infrastructure over individual display. There are no great royal tombs at Mohenjo-Daro, no pyramids glorifying a single ruler, no temples the size of mountains built to honor a dynasty. The public works of the Indus Valley were collective investments. The Great Bath, which served the community, the drainage system, which protected everyone, the granaries, which stored food for the common good, the standardized weights, which facilitated fair trade among all participants. The most impressive achievements of this civilization were shared achievements, investments in the well-being of the population, rather than in the glorification of an elite. This stands in revealing contrast to the civilizations that have dominated the Western historical canon. We know about ancient Egypt in large part because the Egyptians invested enormous resources in monumental projects designed to survive for eternity. The pyramids, the temple complexes, the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, filled with gold and painted with scenes of the afterlife. We know about Rome because the Romans built roads and aqueducts and amphitheatres designed to proclaim the power and permanence of their empire to anyone who encountered them. These cultures prioritized self-representation, and that investment in self-representation is precisely what allowed them to survive in the historical record. Their monuments endured, their inscriptions remained legible, their stories were passed on. The Indus Valley civilization, by contrast, apparently invested in drains, in standardized bricks, in carefully calibrated weights, in the unglamorous, invisible, essential infrastructure of everyday collective life. And because it did not invest in the kind of monumental, self-celebrating projects that tend to survive in both the physical and the historical record, because it built for function rather than for glory, it was forgotten more completely, more thoroughly, and more rapidly than civilizations that were, by many practical measures, less accomplished. There is a profound and uncomfortable lesson embedded in this comparison. We tend to preserve the spectacular, the cathedrals, the castles, the museums, the monuments. We tend to neglect the functional, the sewers, the water treatment plants, the electrical substations, the fiber optic cables, the agricultural research stations, the unglamorous institutions that actually make modern life possible. This is not a small bias. It is a civilizational blind spot, a systematic tendency to value the visible and dramatic over the invisible and essential. And yet it is the invisible, essential infrastructure, the pipes and wires and institutions that no one notices until they fail, that actually keeps a civilization running. When those systems fail, the monuments become meaningless. A cathedral without clean water is not a center of spiritual life. It is a pile of decorated stones in a disease zone. The third implication concerns memory itself, and here the thought becomes truly vertiginous. The human capacity for forgetting is immense, far larger than most of us are comfortable acknowledging. We think of memory, both individual and collective, as a reliable archive, a storehouse that retains what we put into it and delivers it back when we ask. But memory, as psychologists and historians alike have demonstrated, is not an archive. It is a reconstruction. It is an active process of selection, interpretation, and often distortion. We remember what we choose to remember, what our institutions prioritize remembering, what our languages make it easy to express, what our cultures value enough to transmit. Everything else falls through the cracks. The Indus Valley civilization was forgotten for roughly 4,000 years, 4 millennia during which one of the great urban cultures of the ancient world existed as nothing more than an anonymous mound in a floodplain, noticed by nobody, studied by nobody, remembered by nobody. Göbekli Tepe was forgotten for even longer, roughly 9,000 years, nearly as long as the entire span of recorded human history. Cahokia was not merely forgotten, but actively denied, its achievements attributed to mythical races rather than to the indigenous peoples who had actually built it. These are not minor gaps in the historical record. These are chasms, yawning voids in collective memory, large enough to swallow entire civilizations, without leaving so much as a ripple on the surface of human consciousness. We live in a moment when information is more abundant than at any previous point in human existence. We generate more data in a single hour than the entire Indus Valley civilization produced across its entire history. We have libraries, universities, archives, museums, databases, cloud servers, social media platforms, and a global internet connecting billions of people in a continuous flow of information exchange. Surely, we tell ourselves, with all of this, we cannot forget. Surely, with all of this, the kind of total civilizational amnesia that befell the Harappans is impossible in our world. But is it? Our data storage technologies are far more fragile than most of us realize. The average hard drive has a functional lifespan of roughly 3 to 5 years. Solid-state drives last somewhat longer, but not indefinitely. Magnetic tape, used for archival storage, degrades over decades. Optical disks deteriorate. Even cloud storage depends on the continued operation of physical data centers that require constant electricity, cooling, maintenance, and replacement of aging hardware. Our institutions of knowledge preservation, our universities and libraries and archives, are funded by governments and endowments that are themselves subject to economic downturns, political upheavals, and shifting priorities. Our digital file formats change so rapidly that documents created in common formats from the 1990s can be difficult or impossible to open with current software without specialized tools and expertise. The sheer volume of data we produce may, paradoxically, make meaningful preservation harder rather than easier. When everything is recorded, nothing is curated. When every tweet and email and social media post is preserved, the signal-to-noise ratio drops so low that finding anything meaningful in the archive becomes a monumental challenge in itself. We may end up in a situation where vast quantities of data survive, but the ability to make sense of them, to understand their context, to distinguish the important from the trivial, has been lost. This would be a different kind of forgetting from the Harappan kind, but no less devastating in its effects. Mohenjo-Daro sits in its floodplain, its bricks slowly crumbling under the relentless chemistry of salt and sun and water. The seals sit in museum drawers in Karachi and New Delhi and London, their inscriptions unread, their messages undelivered, their meanings unknown and perhaps unknowable. And we stand here, separated from those silent seals by a chasm of 46 centuries, looking across at a civilization that was, in certain practical respects, more advanced than many societies that came centuries and millennia after it. And we cannot hear a single word they said. We cannot understand a single thought they tried to preserve. We are separated from them, not by distance, but by silence, the most complete and most final form of separation that exists. The weight of that silence is immense. It is the weight of every story never passed on, every name never spoken again, every achievement never recognized, every lesson never transmitted. It is the weight of the human capacity for forgetting, a capacity that is as vast and as powerful and as relentless as the human capacity for building, and that operates with the same quiet, steady, cumulative force. We stand at a point in history where we possess more tools for preservation and transmission of knowledge than any previous human society. We have the ability to record, store, and distribute information on a scale that the Harappans could not have imagined. And yet, if we are honest with ourselves, truly honest, we must acknowledge that none of these tools is guaranteed to function over the kind of timescales that the Indus Valley civilization operated within. 700 years. That is the approximate span of the mature Indus Valley civilization. 700 years from now, will anyone be able to read the files on our hard drives? Will our institutions still exist? Will our languages be the same? Will anyone remember what we built and why? The question is not whether we are more technologically capable than the Harappans. We clearly are. The question is whether we are wiser, whether we can look at the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and see in them not just a fascinating historical curiosity, not just a subject for academic papers and documentary narration, but a warning, a direct, urgent, deeply personal warning about the fragility of everything we take for granted, the contingency of everything we assume will endure, and the terrifying ease with which even the most extraordinary human achievements can be swallowed by time and silence and the simple, devastating act of forgetting. That is what Mohenjo-Daro means, not just as an archaeological site, not just as a chapter in the history of South Asia, but as a mirror held up to the present moment, reflecting back to us an image we would rather not see. The image of our own impermanence, rendered in crumbling brick and unreadable script, and the long mournful silence of a city whose name we do not even know. There is a mound in the lower Indus Valley, in the Sindh province of southern Pakistan, where the wind carries the dust of something that was once extraordinary. The dust is fine and pale, the colour of old bone, and it rises in small spirals when the wind comes off the floodplain in the late afternoon. Beneath that dust are the remains of streets that were once straight and purposeful, laid out with a precision that speaks of careful planning and collective agreement. Drains that once carried wastewater away from households with an efficiency that would not be matched in many parts of the world for 4,000 years. Walls that once sheltered families who had names and faces and voices and stories that they told each other in the evening, stories that are now as lost as the language they were told in. Somewhere in those ruins, mixed in with the silt and the salt and the crumbled mortar, there may still be small seals pressed with symbols that once meant something specific and important to someone, symbols that carried messages between traders, between officials, between friends, between strangers, messages that no living person on this planet can read. Mohenjo-Daro is not just a city, it is a monument to the fragility of everything we build, everything we know, everything we are. It is a testament to the impermanence of achievement, to the vulnerability of knowledge, and to the extraordinary, almost unfathomable capacity of time to erase what seemed, in its own moment, solid and permanent and destined to endure. 4,600 years of silence. That is how long these streets have been empty. That is how long these drains have been dry. That is how long these messages have been waiting for a reader who understands them. A reader who may never come, a reader who may not even be possible, because the key to the script may have been lost beyond any hope of recovery. We look at the ruins and we see bricks and drains and walls and fragments of pottery and small carved seals in museum cases. But what we should see, what we must see if we are to learn anything from this place, is ourselves, because we too are builders. We too lay our foundations and raise our structures and write our words and seal our agreements and trust with a confidence that borders on faith that they will endure, that our buildings will stand, that our words will be read, that our names will be remembered, that the things we have made and the things we have thought and the things we have loved will leave some mark on the world that outlasts us. And the Harappans trusted the same thing. They must have. They built their city with fired bricks, choosing one of the most durable construction materials available to them, a material designed to last. They laid their drains with care and precision and engineering skill that represents generations of accumulated understanding. They carved their seals with tools and techniques that required years of training to master. They standardized their weights to fractions of a gram, a level of precision that speaks to a culture that valued accuracy and fairness in its dealings. They did everything right by their own standards and in many cases by ours. They built for permanence, they built with care, they built with intelligence and purpose, and a pride in craftsmanship that is still visible 4,600 years later in the quality of a brick wall or the curve of a drainage channel. And still, the silence came. Still, the forgetting happened. Still, the mound formed over the city, grain by grain, layer by layer, until Mohenjo-Daro was nothing but a low hill in a hot plain, and no one walking over it had any idea what lay below. The silence is what haunts most deeply about Mohenjo-Daro. Not the ruined walls, impressive as they are. Not the broken pottery scattered through the layers. Not the enigmatic seals with their elegant animals and their stubbornly unreadable script. The silence. The absolute, impenetrable 4,600-year-old silence of a civilization that once encompassed millions of human voices and now contains none. We cannot hear them. We cannot understand them. We cannot call them by name, or learn their stories, or discover what they believed about the world and their place in it. They are gone in a way that is more total, more complete, more absolute than simple physical death. A person who dies is remembered by those who loved them, at least for a time. A civilization that is forgotten is gone in a way that erases even the possibility of remembrance. It is gone the way a language is gone when its last speaker closes their eyes and does not wake. It is gone the way a song is gone when the last person who knew the melody forgets it, and there is no recording, no notation, no echo remaining in the world. We have a word for what happened to Mohenjo-Daro. We call it collapse. Historians and archaeologists use the word routinely, almost casually, as if it described a single, comprehensible event, a building falling down, a wall giving way. But the word is too violent, too sudden, too dramatic for what actually occurred in the Indus Valley. Mohenjo-Daro did not collapse the way a bridge collapses in an earthquake, all at once, in a roar of breaking stone and tumbling debris. It dissolved, it faded, it thinned and weakened and dispersed, slowly, incrementally, generation by generation, like a river losing its tributaries one by one, until there is not enough water left to sustain the flow, and the riverbed dries out and cracks, and is covered by dust and eventually by grass, and within a few lifetimes, no one even remembers that a river once flowed there. This is the kind of ending that is most difficult to accept, precisely because it is the kind of ending that is most difficult to recognize while it is happening. The dramatic catastrophe, the earthquake, the invasion, the plague, these are terrible, but they are at least visible. They announce themselves. They demand a response. They leave behind evidence of their passage that subsequent generations can study and learn from. But the slow, invisible erosion, the gradual loss of capacity, the quiet abandonment of standards that once seemed essential but are now merely inconvenient, the imperceptible drift from excellence to adequacy to mediocrity to failure, this kind of ending gives no warning. Each step is so small that no individual generation notices the decline. Each loss is so minor that no one protests or sounds an alarm. The drain that once worked perfectly is allowed to silt up because no one has time to clean it this season. The standard that once governed the weight of a trade weight is relaxed because enforcement is expensive and the traders have stopped complaining. The script that once recorded the transactions of a great trading civilization is taught to fewer and fewer children because there are more immediately practical things to learn. And gradually, imperceptibly, the accumulation of small neglects becomes an avalanche of loss, and by the time anyone realizes what has happened, it is far too late to reverse it. This is how civilizations end. Not with the dramatic crash that makes for compelling narratives and memorable history. Not with the kind of clear, identifiable catastrophe that allows historians to draw a neat line on a timeline and say, here, on this date, the civilization ended. But with a long, slow, barely perceptible dimming, a gradual retreat from complexity, a quiet surrender of knowledge and standards and ambition, so slow and so gentle that no one living through it experiences anything dramatic enough to record. By the time the last generation walks away from the empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro, they may not even realize that they are the last. They may not know that they are closing a chapter that will not be reopened for 4,000 years. They are simply leaving a place that no longer works, a city where the drains are broken, the granaries are empty, and the trade routes have dried up along with the rivers. We are told that we live in an age of unprecedented progress, and in many specific, measurable ways, that is true. The achievements of modern civilization, in science, in medicine, in technology, in the expansion of human rights and the reduction of extreme poverty, are genuine and impressive. But the Harappans, too, lived in their own age of unprecedented progress. Their drainage systems were, for their time, unprecedented. Their urban planning was unprecedented. Their standardized weights and measures were unprecedented. Their long-distance trade networks were unprecedented. And every single one of those unprecedented achievements is now a silent, crumbling ruin in a salt-eaten floodplain in southern Pakistan, visited by tourists and archaeologists, and the occasional wild dog, understood by no one in the way that its builders understood it, read by no one in the way that its scribes once read it. Mohenjo-Daro does not ask us to despair. That would be too simple, and the lesson of the city is not a simple one. It asks us to pay attention. It asks us to look honestly at what we have built, and to ask ourselves, with genuine seriousness rather than comfortable complacency, what we are doing to ensure that it endures. Not just the shining visible achievements, the skyscrapers and the satellites and the server farms, but the invisible foundations, the infrastructure that no one notices, the institutions that transmit knowledge from one generation to the next, the traditions of maintenance and repair and renewal that keep a civilization alive and functioning long after the original builders have passed on. Because it is those traditions, not the buildings themselves, that ultimately determine whether a civilization endures or vanishes. The bricks of Mohenjo-Daro are still standing, some of them, after 4,600 years, weathered, worn, eaten by salt, but physically present in the world. The civilization that made those bricks, however, is gone. The people who chose the clay, who mixed the material, who shaped the bricks in their molds, who fired them in their kilns, who carried them to the building site and laid them in courses and bound them with mortar, those people and everything they knew and believed and valued have vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The bricks outlasted the builders, the drains outlasted the engineers, the seals outlasted the scribes, the material endured, the understanding did not. And that is the final haunting, irreducible truth of Mohenjo-Daro, the truth that settles into the bones and does not leave. It is not the structures that matter most, however magnificent they may be. It is not the technology, however impressive. It is not the infrastructure, however far ahead of its time. What matters most, what determines whether a civilization lives or dies across the long sweep of centuries, is the understanding that creates and maintains these things. The human knowledge, the human skill, the human organization, the human commitment, the collective will that brings a city into being, that keeps its drains flowing, and its streets clean, and its weights accurate, and its script alive, and readable, and meaningful. When that understanding is lost, when that commitment falters, when that collective will disperses, the city is already dead, even if its walls are still standing. The walls are just the skeleton. The understanding is the life. Somewhere beneath the mound, beneath the dust and the silt and the crystallized salt of 46 centuries, there are messages waiting. Small squares of carved stone bearing the images of magnificent bulls and stately elephants and enigmatic figures seated in silent contemplation, surrounded by symbols arranged in careful, deliberate rows. Each symbol placed with intention, each mark carrying a meaning that was once as clear, as obvious, as immediately comprehensible as the words you are hearing right now. Those messages have been waiting for a reader for nearly 5,000 years. They may wait 5,000 more. They may wait forever. And the wind blows across the mound, carrying the dust of something that was once alive, once purposeful, once filled with voices and footsteps, and the clatter of commerce, and the murmur of prayer, or song, or argument, or laughter. Something that once held the dreams and fears, and accumulated wisdom, of a people who built wonders in a floodplain and trusted, as all people trust, that the world would remember them, that their works would endure, that their words would be heard, that their names would survive. The world forgot. The works crumbled. The words fell silent. The names vanished into a silence deeper and more complete than death. And the mound remains, patient, silent, waiting.